There we go. I don't think I was, let me say again, good evening. So Proverbs chapter 4 is where our first verse or verses will come from. Let me see if I can get this casting. There we go. So as I mentioned, this is the beginning of our next major section. That first one being self and God, just kind of general wisdom principles. This one is dealing with speech, and I'll go ahead and give you the subcategories. I think all of these, maybe with the exception of one or two, these major sections, the very first subcategory is general. Because sometimes they just don't really fall into thanks, y'all. Sometimes they don't really just fall into, unless you're just going to have like a bazillion subcategories. So some of them I just made a general category and put them in that. But so you got general for speech. And then the next subcategory we'll look at is, I call it sparingly. In other words, not talking too much, not being too eager to speak without thinking first. Another subcategory after that will be hurtful. In other words, hurtful speech. Then the next category after that is peacemaking, using our speech for peacemaking as opposed to hurtful speech or stirring up strife and such. And going kind of with that, but I made it a separate subcategory, encouragement, using our speech to encourage others as opposed to discouraging others. And then one of the larger subcategories is the next one, which is deceitful speech, and just warnings against deceitful speech, lying and such. And then the last one we'll look at is gossip. And that was, I don't even think I remembered to mention this Sunday morning, the sermon I did answering the Q&A question. I was looking recently at the Q&A, the list of questions that I keep, and realizing, as I've said numerous times recently, that I've gotten kind of behind, but it never fails. Like I'll have a Q&A, and I get, if I answer 3 questions in the Q&A, there'll be 4 questions in the box. It's just kind of the way it's gone. I don't mind that, and please don't take that as me complaining, because I enjoy the questions and answers. I know I'm teaching and preaching something that is relatable to at least somebody in the audience if I'm doing a Q&A, because it's questions that have been put in by folks in the congregation. So I like that. It's just sometimes my OCD wants to be caught up on that, and it's just, it kind of doesn't happen, and I try to at least stay close, but I've gotten a little bit further behind lately. And so some of those I've been doing as sermons, and I saw the question on gossip, and I was like, oh yeah, that'd be a good one to do as we segue into this next major section of our Wednesday night study on speech. So that said, again, if you want to turn to chapter 4, as we've been doing, I'll have these on the screen here, and we'll go, if you're wanting to look in your own copy of the Word, we'll move forward, at least in each subsection. So when we finish the general section, which I don't think we will tonight, but when we do finish that and we move into the, what I said the next subsection was? Sparingly. We move into that, then we'll go back and start moving forward again. Where I made some extra notes. I put them on my phone. I forgot. All right, so Proverbs 4:23 and 24 says, keep thy heart with all diligence. Familiar verse here. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Some of these verses, sometimes there'll be a little overlap, and we may see some of the same ones, or at least within a string of verses in other subsections, but I did my best to try to separate these. But here he says to keep your heart with all diligence, and we've talked about this in other contexts. Really, you could put this with, I was trying to think, I don't know, I'd have to go back and look, but this might have been with our self and God section as well, because it certainly applies there. Guarding your heart, keeping your thoughts right, because as Jesus says, and I put it here with speech because I was thinking in terms of, Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, what? The mouth speaketh. And so, obviously, verse 24 specifically mentions speech, but that's even verse 23, it reminds us of that statement of Jesus, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. So, in other words, if my thoughts are not good thoughts, then at some point, that's going to come out in my speech, right? If my thoughts are good thoughts, then that's going to come out in my speech. And I also, of course, am reminded of Philippians 4:8. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Why? Because out of the heart, from the heart, come the issues of life. And out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so it's very, very important that we guard our thoughts. And that's the idea here in verse 23. And of course, going with that, verse 24, put away from you a deceitful mouth, put perverse lips far from you. But it begins in the heart, having a heart that is focusing on the right things. We could say, as one writer did, I'm paraphrasing, but kind of the idea here was this proverb cuts both ways. It exalts those who speak of noble things. It condemns those who talk only of earthly things, or especially sinful things. And then in verse 24, this is interesting to me because I think this is the one I'm thinking of. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong verse there. I was thinking, it's not at all what I was thinking it was. Verse 24, devious talk is what the ESV has. Put away from you crooked speech. New King James says, put away from you a deceitful mouth. King James has a froward mouth. So sometimes you see a same idea, but just slightly different wording from different versions. That second phrase of verse 24, New King James has perverse lips. So does the Old King James. And then devious talk, crooked speech, was the first phrase in the ESV. Devious talk here in that second phrase. But both of these terms in the Hebrew, they relate to crookedness. And sometimes we even today talk about crooked speech. And sometimes we even talk about a person being crooked. The idea of, if straight is going in the way that is right, then crooked being getting out of the way. But it's even here more specific to speech. You have the deceitful mouth. And again, here's where I like the Old King James, because you got that word froward, and maybe even the ESV kind of captures it best here, crooked speech. But that second phrase, perverse, perhaps is better than devious to capture that idea of. But they both kind of indicate crookedness, and it's the opposite of what we would call straight talk. We sometimes talk about crooked people, crooked speech, but we also talk about, sometimes we'll say, hey, give it to me straight. And sometimes we say, you go ask so-and-so, hey, you can trust him. He's always going to be straight with you. That person's always, he's a straight talker. And so we understand that even in our modern terms. All right, Proverbs, 8 is next. (8:13). Now, keep in mind, this is one of those, if you wrote down or if you got one of those sheets that we printed out last week with the other two subsections that we didn't cover, because blessings of wisdom was that one of the last two subsections of that major section, number 1. And then the other one was, I called it wisdom personified. Two very fairly lengthy sections that are just wisdom pictured as speaking, as a person speaking, particularly a lady speaking to a young man, encouraging him to follow the ways of wisdom. This is part of one of those sections of wisdom personified. And so bear in mind, this is wisdom speaking to us, as it were, saying that the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride, and arrogancy, and the evil way, and the froward mouth do I hate. So wisdom is saying these are things that I don't have anything to do with. I'm not putting up with that. So if you want wisdom to be your companion, again, and wisdom's, as it were, crying out to young men, and we say young men, but bear in mind, it's everybody, saying, hey, trust me, you want me to be your companion. You want to walk through life with me by your side because it's the best life. But there are some things that you can't walk with them and also have wisdom by your side. They're just not going to. We sometimes use the expression like oil and water. Just not going to go together. So wisdom says, fear of the Lord is to hate evil. And lists some very particular things: pride, arrogance, evil way. I'm reading now New King James. They're on the left-hand side of this. Pride, arrogance, the evil way, perverse mouth, I hate. Very similar wording there in the ESV, perverted speech for that last phrase. Wisdom says, I won't be around such things as that. And so if you want wisdom to be your companion, you can't be fooling around with those things. All right, let's go to chapter 10. What are we in? Chapter 8? Let's see if we can go 10. Here's a little bit of a longer section, at least for most of these subsections for the rest of the way, with the exception of a few, particularly in the section on relationships. Sometimes there'll be more verses there, but a lot of these going forward, even individual subsections, most of the time it's going to be just a verse or two. But here we have verses 8 through 14 of chapter 10 here. So it says, the wise in heart will receive commandments, but a prating fool shall fall. Verse 9, he that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known. He that winketh with the eye causeth sorrow, but a prating fool shall fall. The mouth of a righteous man is a well of life, but violence covereth the mouth of the wicked. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. In the lips of him that hath understanding wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. Wise men lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. All right, so just a few observations here. Verse 8, you see there on the right, the ESV has a babbling fool. Might be more how we would say it. Prating is not a word that we use a whole lot, but that would be kind of the idea. Babbling. And you may recall from Sunday morning, the lesson we looked at Sunday morning. I was trying to remember the other reference, and it just escapes me now. But 3 John, we're talking about Diotrephes. That's the verb form of it. But I cannot remember the other reference that we looked at for the main word. But anyways, it's a form of it, the verb form. In 3 John 10, I think it is, talking about Diotrephes. And it says he was prating. John, the apostle, says he's prating against us, which would seem to be a reference to the apostles, maybe just the faithful in general. But prating against us with malicious words. And so John says he was prating, but it's that word. If you recall, I don't remember what the Greek word was, but it was the one that came from a root word that means to bubble. The idea there that the bubbles aren't really doing anything, they're not, so it came to represent, especially when used of speech, in the Koine Greek, empty, worthless, babbling, foolish speech. And sometimes it was rendered with the word prating. But again, it's just not a word we use as much. So I kind of like babbling there. But that's that idea, a babbling fool. And that last phrase, will fall, I think it's the King James and New King James has it. I just lost my place on my sheet here. Yeah, shall fall, and the King James as well, is better in the ESV as come to ruin. I think fall, probably we can figure out it's not talking about literally physically falling down, but it is a little bit better rendered, I guess, as we would say it, to say he will come to ruin. So it talks about the one walking in integrity, walks securely. Again, remember these are truisms. But, I'm in verse 9 now, by the way. But he who perverts his ways will become known is the way. Be known, I think, is what the Old King James says. Here, the New King James has become known. Again, I think ESV might be the best way of putting it. He'll be found out, discovered. And so it's eventually going to come out because he's crooked, and it'll come out in his speech, it'll come out in his life, and you'll see that. That's just the way of the world. That's the way things go. 10 verse 10. Again, the word prating, babbling fool will come to ruin. So you see the same phrase there, second phrase, as the second phrase of, first phrase? Nope, it is the second phrase of verse 8. Now, verse 11, the mouth of a righteous man is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. I like the ESV, the way it puts it. The mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Now, there is a footnote, which I don't actually see it here. In the ESV online, it's got a note here, and I don't know why it's not in this one. Am I on the ESV? Yeah. I was just certain that. Let me go down to the end of the chapter and see. Yeah, there is. Oh, it's got the note on verse 6, but it doesn't put it on this verse for some reason. But you can see the footnote, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. But it seems like it's, again, more how we would say it, to say the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. It's the idea of that duplicity in speech, sometimes hypocrisy in speech, and he's covering up or concealing other intentions. And so, I like that. I like that way of rendering it. Conceals violence seems to be a little bit better to capture the meaning. Then verse 12. I mean, you don't need a lot of commentary here, right? Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. Hatred stirs up strife. Both ESV and New King James have. Love covers all sins or offenses, ESV. But isn't it true that just a mean, unkind, hateful, spiteful person, they constantly expect conflict, confrontation, and they stir it up and expect it from others because of, what's the psychological term? Is the term I'm thinking of projection, when we expect people to act how we're thinking? Is that the right word? I don't know any. Let's see. Okay, I do see a couple of people nodding yes. So that's kind of how that tends to go, right? If I'm a mean, nasty person, I expect that from other people. I'm expecting conflict. I'm expecting confrontation, and so I tend to stir that up in others because I'm expecting it from them, because it's in my heart. And that's just what you find so often, again, just as you walk through life. This is another interesting thing to me from this verse. It's translated covers. that second phrase of verse 12. Scroll up to that. Old King James has covereth. It's the same Hebrew word as up here in verse 11. Violence covers the mouth of the wicked. Same Hebrew word. So in other words, you've got a wicked person who's covering sin. You got a righteous person who's covering sin. What's the difference? What's the difference there? What'd you say? That's exactly what I had in mind. Motive. Motives matter. One is, and I made some notes on this, the wicked and the righteous, they both hide or overlook, if you want to put it that way, sin, but for different reasons. The wicked man, he wants to hide sin because he wants to cover up his own sin, right? Act like nothing's wrong. But a good person, they're overlooking sin because they want to try to help others. Not that they want to just ignore it and pretend like it's not there, but they want to help others deal with it. And so one is covering sin out of deceitfulness. The other is covering or overlooking sin out of a spirit of forgiveness and wanting to help somebody to learn from a mistake, to do better going forward, and so on. You can see where, man, those are vastly different motives, right? One motive of deceit, one motive of forgiveness. And, ironically, some of the most deceitful people are often the least forgiving. And some of the most patient, forgiving people often are some of the most honest. So you can see the truth of hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins. Very interesting thoughts there. And then verse 14, before we move on to the next passage, wise people store up knowledge is how the New King James puts it, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. Again, I like the way the ESV puts this. The mouth of a fool brings ruin near. And again, this kind of goes a little bit back into our section of self and God, but I mean, again, there's going to be overlap with some of these, especially that section. If I know somebody brings ruin near, do I want to be around that person? I mean, not if I have sense, right? If you know, in fact, sometimes we get, you have people that get superstitious. We understand that stuff's nonsense, but sometimes people will get superstitious, and if they become convinced that somebody is bad luck, when that person comes around, they're kind of like, whoa, you get away. I want to keep as far away from that person as possible because they view that person as bad luck. Well, bad luck, good luck, those are nothing to that. But a fool does bring ruin near. And a person who is foolish in speech, you better believe they'll bring ruin near. And I don't want to be anywhere near that. So kind of, again, sort of a warning here from God. Just be aware of that. And sometimes if you're around when that foolish person and the foolish talk brings ruin near and it opens up a pit, you know what sometimes happens? In terms of military and politics and things like that, sometimes they use the term collateral damage. If we're not careful, we can become collateral damage when the fool's ruin comes near. So we'd do well to stay far away. All right, let's go to, still in this chapter. Just scroll down a little bit to chapter 21. Lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of wisdom. Do what? What did I say? I say chapter 21? Oh, I'm sorry. That's why I hear pages turning. I'm like, it's just down to the same chapter a little bit. Sorry, verse 21. Thank you, Brother Chris. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of wisdom. Lack of heart is more literal translation, but it's the idea of wisdom, or, as the ESV says, lack of sense. The Old King James says, lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for want of wisdom, lack of wisdom. The idea here is just that wise words benefit many people, right? But foolish words lead many to ruin and death. It's kind of what we were just talking about the fool bringing ruin near. If you're around, you can end up falling in that pit. But you know what? How many times have people been helped out, lifted up, because they were around somebody who was wise, godly? In fact, some of us men can say, you know what, we married up. I don't think I'd ever heard it until I met Brother Chris. He would sometimes say, you outkicked your coverage. I like that expression. And I mean, that a lot of us men, we can say, hey, you know what, I've been very blessed by the association with a godly woman who has done me well. And that happens. Sometimes we can be blessed by being around wise people, but we can also many times suffer being around foolish people. But there's a lot of truth to that. This is, by the way, if you back up to, we'll get these in other subsections on speech, but this is, verse 21 is the fourth of a little 4-verse segment dealing with right speech. Whoever hides hatred has lying lips. Obviously, we'll cover that under deceit. Whoever spreads slander is a fool. We'll cover that under gossip. And the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. We'll cover that under using speech sparingly. But he who restrains his lips is wise. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. So again, 4-verse section there that ends with verse 21. All right, now let's go to the next chapter, chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 11. Reading from King James, by the blessing of the upright, the city is exalted, but it is overthrown by the mouth of the wicked. I'm reminded of, just went blank. I think I know it's Proverbs 14. Is it 28? 14:28? Righteousness exalteth the nation. Why can I not remember that? 34. Yeah. Righteousness exalteth the nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. I'm reminded of that because, as I put in my notes, chapter 11, verse 11, this is also true of a family. This is also true of a nation. We could even say, to an extent, it's true of a congregation. By the blessing of the upright, the family is exalted. The nation is exalted. The congregation is exalted. Or, as the text says here, the city. But it is overthrown by the mouth of the wicked. All those situations, it's just as true, right? Those are powerful words, again, showing the power of influence and that our actions don't affect just us. Our words often don't affect just us. So, as Romans 14 says, that no man liveth to himself, none of us liveth to himself, no man dieth to himself. No man is an island. We sometimes paraphrase that concept. Okay. Next chapter, chapter 12. I don't know why I keep wanting to say verse for chapter and vice versa. Chapter 12. And it's verse says, verse 6 first. I'm overlooking one. Verse 6 says, the words of the wicked or to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. And you see the similar rendering, but slightly different there in New King James and ESV. Seems the indication here is the mouth of the upright delivers them from those words of the wicked, lying in wait for blood. The words of the wicked, maybe it's a false accusation, maybe it's some kind of a twisting, but in some way intended to be the downfall of a righteous person or an innocent person. But the mouth of the upright delivers them from such. That seems to be the indication there. All right, same chapter, 12, dropping down to 13 and 14, where it says the wicked is snared, or ensnared, New King James has, by the transgression of his lips, but the just shall come out of trouble. Verse 14 says, a man shall be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hand shall be rendered unto him. I was thinking one of these had, ESV says on that last phrase of verse 14, the work of a man's hand comes back to him. And that reminds me of Galatians 6:7. Whatever a man sows, that shall also reap. We sometimes say it comes back to you in that sense. But the verse there, verse 13, the wicked is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, or an evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips. We sometimes use a phrase, it's a bit of a blunt and kind of, I don't know if crude is the right word, but blunt for sure. But we sometimes use this expression, maybe it's somebody that we know is a fool or wicked or engaged in something that is not right. And maybe you're talking to somebody, you're wringing your hands. He's just dishonest, and he uses gossip and slander and whatever, trying to get his way, whatnot. And sometimes somebody will reply to that, and they'll say, you just give him enough. I know where I'm going with that. Give him enough what? Rope. Why? He'll hang himself. That's the idea there, verse 13. The wicked man sometimes, and yeah, have you ever felt that way? Maybe it might be a personal attack. It might be part of a bigger attack, but there's somebody who's using just ungodly speech, whether it be slander, whether it be gossip, whether it be just lies in general, and you feel like, what can the righteous person do? Because I can't stoop to that level. That's not right. Just because somebody's being, slanderous toward me, I can't just turn around and say, well, you know what? I mean, he started it. Well, that wouldn't be right. And so sometimes you feel like, well, what can you do? I mean, if there's going to be no scruples, how do you keep up with that? And sometimes that's very wise people have given that advice before. Maybe it's in the form of that expression. Maybe it's some other similar expression, but the idea is the same. The wicked will be ensnared by the transgression of his lips. Give them enough rope, they'll hang themselves. That is just as true now as it was back then. All right, I think I got another one here in 12 before we move on. Yeah, 12:23. A prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. We discussed this before. I think this was in the reasons why we struggle in relationships, or reasons why sometimes people don't like us. That the prudent man conceals knowledge. New King James says, ESV says the same thing. Very similar wording across the board on this. The heart of fools proclaims foolishness. One commentator, again, I'm just sort of paraphrasing here, he put it something like this. How many of us have been in conversations that were dominated by those with the least to say, the least amount of knowledge, in other words, and where those who had something substantial to contribute were essentially forced into silence? because the fool or fools wouldn't shut up. I mean, you ever been in that situation? I could get us, some of us, in trouble, and I'll just go ahead and be the first to admit. I could get some of us in trouble, including myself, and say, have you ever been that person who just, you talk too much and you dominate the conversation so much that the ones with something substantial to contribute couldn't do so? By the way, does anybody have any comments here? Anything to add? Y'all are quiet tonight, and we haven't even talked about using speech sparingly. And now, here I'm talking about the one dominating the conversation. And do what? The Sunday morning lesson at home. Joyce told me after service, she said, why didn't you just say it was me and Beth? And I said, well, okay. Beth said, I was quiet because I was praying for Joyce. I said, man, they got me so good with that. I was not expecting that when I got her text, and then Beth said that, and I was like, man, that's funny. But yeah, we've all seen situations like that, and I've often said back when I used to work with computers a little bit, and it's, of course, that's changed a lot now. I don't really know much more than enough to be dangerous these days, but Brian's, that's his thing that he does on the regular, and I think Brian would agree that that's an area especially where I noticed it. Like sometimes the people who know the least, they can tell you all about it, and they can mess up something quicker than just about anybody. And the one, like I learned in a conversation about tech stuff, the one that's sitting there kind of quiet, that's the one that knows. And you better just like say, hey, you're sitting over there quiet. Do you know anything about this? Well, yeah, I know a little bit about it. Okay, well, tell us. And the next thing you know, the dude starts talking, and you're like, a little? You're the expert here. And sometimes it just takes somebody getting the one who doesn't know quieting down so that the one who does can talk. And I suspect that's true in a lot of different fields, including sometimes with Scripture. So, a prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools, in fact, there is a proverb, I can't think of the reference right off the top of my head, but it just says, it pours forth. The mouth of fools poureth forth foolishness. All right, so if nobody's going to say anything else, we'll go to chapter 15. Oh, man. Chapter 15. Of course, you can see verse 1. That's a familiar verse, and that'll be in one of our other subsections. Soft answer turns away wrath. A harsh word stirs up anger, is how the New King James has it. Here, verse 2 is the one we're looking at in this just general subsection. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright. Oh, there's the verse I was thinking of, verse 15, verse 2 of chapter 15. But the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. So the mouth of fools is just pouring out foolishness. And I just realized I skipped. How did I do that? I'm sorry, go back to 14. I just didn't have any extra notes on it. I was looking at my notes page instead of my verses. So we can keep them in order here. 14 verse 3. Some of these, they're just not, they're pretty self-explanatory, so I didn't have any notes there, and I was looking at that note I had on my phone. All right, 14:3, in the mouth of a fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. Again, that's similar to the verse we noticed just a moment ago, preserve them from the foolish talk and the sinfulness of the foolish person. Now, same chapter, let's drop down to verse 9, 14:9. Again, not a whole lot you can say here. It's pretty self-explanatory. Fools make a mock at sin, but among the righteous there is favor. Now, you see in the ESV a slightly different rendering. Fools make a mock at the guilt offering. So that's just sometimes there's a little bit of a textual variant there. But fools mocking at sin, and again, that could be in the form of speech, that could be in the form of life, how they live their lives. Even if it's at the guilt offering, it's the idea of mocking things that are holy, things that are of a spiritual nature. I think it's fair to say, most often, more often than not, that's in the form of speech. But we can also make a mock at it by just how we behave and act toward it. Now, chapter 15, verse 2. Sorry about that. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. Again, kind of paraphrasing what this one commentator said, how many of us have a hard time keeping our mouths shut. We feel compelled to offer an opinion, to give a personal illustration, or whatever it might be on every subject. And as this one guy put it, can't remember the guy's name. It was just a commentary on, like a short commentary on Proverbs. But he says, quote, gushing folly, end quote. Gushing folly only makes a fool more foolish, as we are forced to listen to his words while we miss out on the potential contribution of the wise man who has been silenced. So very similar to what we were talking about there in chapter 12, verse 23. All right, 15, verse 4. See if we can hustle through 15 here, and that'll be a stopping point for us. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. This is a colorful illustration of the effects of a healing tongue or a deceitful tongue. The effects on others, by the way, is what I meant to say by that. Scripture is not teaching us to flatter. It's not teaching us to be less than honest. But it's saying be kind rather than cruel. I don't have to say to somebody, oh, that was amazing. It was so, wow, just the best I've ever heard. Best I've ever seen. Well, yeah, that's flattery, and that gets to the realm of being dishonest if I don't really think that. Now, if I think that, that's, sure, whatever. But what I'm saying is, and what the Bible teaches us is, you don't have to do that, but you also don't have to say, if somebody says, well, hey, how do you think that went? How does this look? You say, whoa, pretty bad. I mean, sometimes when I was starting off preaching at a place there in White Plains close to my house, there was a brother from my home congregation that would come out sometimes and listen, and put these people at the back, mostly elderly members in that congregation, and they were trying to encourage a young preacher, and they'd say, oh, that was so great, you did wonderful, man, that was beautiful. And then I'd ask him, Paul was his name, and I'd say, Paul, now, I know you're not just going to blow smoke. Tell me, how was that? And he'd say, I've heard you do better. And he would give it to me straight, and that's why I would ask him, because I knew he would. But, even then, he wouldn't say, boy, that was awful, Chad. He might say, I've heard you do better, or here's some things I think areas where it needed work or whatever. But again, not flattering, being dishonest, but you don't have to be a jerk either. So he says, how does this look? You may say, well, it's not my favorite. You could say that versus, that's hideous. That's a big difference. So that's kind of the idea. All right, drop down to verse 7 of 15. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the foolish doeth not so. Well, you don't really need any comment on that. Lips of the wise, they spread knowledge, but lips of the foolish, no, not happening with him. 15:23, verse 23. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. Or how good is it, is how the old King James puts it. And here, as we mentioned Sunday in the sermon, Sunday morning, it's the idea of the right words at the right time. Because you can have the right words at the wrong time. And of course, you can certainly have the wrong words at the right time. It's getting it together, combining both of those. All right, let's look at 15:26 real quick. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant. And the reason for that thoughts versus words, thoughts in the first phrase, words in the second, is because God knows the thoughts. The thoughts of the wicked precede the words of the wicked, and God knows them when they're still thoughts. And even in thought, it's an abomination to the Lord. Using better, smarter, wiser speech. All right, we'll pick up and move forward from chapter 16, Lord willing, next week. And then I think next week we should get into the next subsection on using our speech sparingly. Thank y'all.